So after once you have login, click on the courses. There you can see course list, and in this course list you can see wide range of courses. Click on play course. If you have not purchased, you can see only 3 demo videos. After purchasing, you can see number of videos which are given here, and you can click on that video and you can click on play button, and video will start playing. And you can
Hi friends, my name is Sarvan Kumar. I am your economy faculty.
and
Welcome to
there are
Rathod's
settings
IAS.
here.
Hi friends, my name is Sarvan Kumar. Welcome to Rathod's IAS. Friends, in the previous class, we have clearly discussed about the Yokohama strategy for disaster management, and we also discussed about the Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction. Right? These two are the part of the conference on disaster risk reduction. Right? And as a part of it, we also do have the SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction, and in this class we are going to discuss about the SENDAI framework. Now, the SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction is a 15-year. Now you have to remember this period. While the Hyogo framework is for 10 years period, the SENDAI framework is for 15 years period. It is a voluntary, non-binding agreement. It is a non-binding agreement. These kind of keywords are very much important for both your prelims as well as mains. You need to incorporate them and you need to keep them in your mind while answering your prelims questions. So SENDAI framework is a 15-year voluntary non-binding agreement which recognizes that the states have the primary role to reduce the disaster risk. But the responsibility should be shared with the other stakeholders, including the local governments, this private sector and other stakeholders. Right? So, in such a way, if you observe the disaster management framework in India, it is mostly aligned with this kind of definition. Say for example, the main responsibility of managing the disaster even in India is held with the state. State here means the government. We do have an institutional framework at a hierarchical level from top to bottom for effectively managing the disaster in the country. See, we have clearly discussed about the National Disaster Management Authority at an apex level in the country for effective management of disaster, and we do have the State Disaster Management Authority at all the states, and we do have this District Disaster Management Authorities and Local Disaster Management Authorities. So in such a way, it is an institutional hierarchical approach, and when we discussed about this approach, there we have also discussed that these institutions not only going to do the work alone, but they are going to involve the rest of the ministries and departments, thereby making it as a multi-stakeholder approach for effectively managing the disaster. So in such a way, if you observe the SENDAI framework definition, right, it is an agreement, but it is non-binding for a 15-year voluntary. If at all it wishes, they can volunteer to take up it. Right? It recognizes the state has the primary role to reduce the disaster risk, but the responsibility should be shared with the rest of the governments such as local governments and also with the private sector and rest of the other stakeholders. The SENDAI framework for disaster The SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction 2015 and 2030 was adopted at Third United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was held in the year 2015 in the Miyagi in Japan. Here, in our previous class, we have discussed about this United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, where it is mainly a conference of all the key stakeholders, where it is mainly conducted to discuss the solutions with respect to enabling the disaster management, doing the disaster management and enabling or reducing the disaster risk reduction, keeping in the mind the sustainable development. So as a part of it, we got this Yokohama strategy, Hyogo framework, and now we are discussing about this SENDAI framework, right? I hope you just try to interlink the things. It is the successor instrument to Hyogo framework. We have discussed about it in the previous class. Right? It is up to 2015, right? Now in this class, we are also going to discuss the difference between this Hyogo framework and a SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction, the approach they follow for effective management of disaster, and the 4 priority areas for action under the SENDAI framework include: first one is understanding the disaster risk. Disaster risk management should be based on an understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions. right, with respect to vulnerability, capacity, exposure of the persons and assets to the havoc, hazard characteristics and environment. So in such a way, understanding the disaster risk with respect to all the dimensions is one of the important priority areas under the SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction. Now, the next priority area is strengthening the disaster risk governance to manage the disaster risk. Disaster risk governance at national level, regional level and global level is very much important for the prevention, mitigation and preparedness, response and rehabilitation. Right? All these are the phases of post-disaster management phase. Right? It fosters collaboration and partnerships. This is the second priority area under the SENDAI framework. And when we look at the third priority area, investing in disaster risk, right, reduction for resilience, right, there should be enough public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures are essential to enhance the economic, social, health and cultural resilience of persons. Not only them, communities and countries and their assets as well as environment. Right? Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience is very much important priority area under this SENDAI framework. Next, we have enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better. We have discussed about the build back better in our previous class. So enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Right? The recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction, which is the actions or measures which we usually hear in the post-disaster management phase. The recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction phase is a critical opportunity to build back better, right, including the integrating disaster risk reduction as well as the developmental measures. Right. So these are the 4 priority areas for action under disaster risk reduction under the SENDAI framework. Next, India has been designated as the champions for disaster risk reduction (DDR) for its efforts to facilitate regional supports towards enabling community resilience in the Asia Pacific region. And in the next class, we are going to discuss about many leadership initiatives taken by India in the field of disaster management. Right? We are going to discuss about what are the actions which have taken by India in this region. United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has declared India as first regional champion after this SENDAI framework or after the SENDAI agreement. Right. Now, when we look at the SENDAI framework, it has the 7 global targets need to be achieved. When we discussed about the criticism against the Disaster Management Plan 2016, which was formulated in India, there we have discussed that although our plan was formulated on the lines of the SENDAI framework, but there is no target as such we have taken similar to this SENDAI framework. Right? So these are those targets that we have discussed about in our previous class. So the first target said substantially reduce global disaster mortality death rate by 2030, aiming to lower the average per 1 lakh global mortalities between 20 and 30. That needed to be achieved by 2030 when compared to 2005 and 15, where we have this period for Hyogo framework for disaster reduction. Right? Substantially reduce the number of affected people globally by 2030, aiming to lower the average global figure for 1 lakh between 2030 when compared to the period of Hyogo framework, that is 2005 to 15. Reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product by 2030. Right? It is another important target under the SENDAI framework. Now, substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Right? These targets need to be achieved. Right? And basic services, among them health and educational facilities to be taken care of, including through development and resilience by 2030. Right? All these targets need to be achieved by 2030. Substantially increase the number of countries with national and local risk reduction strategies by 2030. Right? As you know, this is a 15-year voluntary agreement which starts from 2015 and ends by 2030. So the targets also set for 2030. right? Substantially enhance, right, international cooperation to developing countries, enhancing the international cooperation to developing countries through adequate and sustainable support to complement their national actions for implementation of framework by 2030. So the developing countries might take some actions for effectively managing this disaster. So their efforts need to be reinforced, right, by substantially enhancing the international cooperation, right? Understood? Substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster information and assessment to the people by 2030, as sensitizing the people and effective early warning systems, right, constituting effective early warning systems to properly disseminate information with respect to any disaster to all the stakeholders is very much important step that need to be taken, right? We have clearly discussed about it in the disaster management cycle. So these are the targets that to be achieved, right? 7 global targets that to be achieved by those countries who voluntarily take up this agreement, right? Sendai agreement. Now when we look at the India's progress after this Sendai declaration, right, post Sendai declaration, the government of India have taken several initiatives. Say for example, India have successfully hosted the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Reduction in the year 2016 in the month of November, and adopted a New Delhi declaration and a regional action plan for the implementation of Sendai Framework, right? We are going to discuss about it. The government of India has issued a set of priority actions to all the state governments based on the goals, targets and priorities of Sendai Framework. We do have 7 targets that need to be achieved over a period of time by 2030, and accordingly the yearly targets might be there, and that targets need to be achieved, right, yearly for overall achievement of Sendai targets by the year 2030. Such kind of priority actions have been given by the government of India to the state governments to achieve the goals that we have as a global targets under Sendai Framework. In line with the Sendai Priority 4, right, National Disaster Response Force is strengthened both in terms of state-of-art training and equipment, right? We do have some priority areas under the Sendai Framework. See, we do have here 4 priority areas. So enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better, recover, rehabilitation, reconstruction, which is a part of post-disaster period, need to be strengthened. So under this priority 4, the NDRFs been strengthened, right? The government has expressed keenness to share India's expertise and help other countries in disaster response, right? In an effort to augment the capacity building in the field of disaster management, National Institution for Disaster Management have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Jawaharlal Nehru University for financial assistance and academic cooperation for the establishment of a Center for Excellence in the Disaster Research and Resilience Building at JNU, right? This would promote the higher education and research in the field of disaster management, right? These are the important initiatives taken up by the government after Sendai declaration, right? Now when we look at the difference between the Hyogo framework, which is an earlier framework for disaster management, now we have adopted this Sendai framework. If we look at the differences, simple, right? The Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction, right, 2005 to 15 is a successor instrument to Yokohama framework for action. Right? Earlier we do have this Yokohama framework for action. Now the Sendai framework, right? Sendai framework 2015 to 30 is a successor instrument to Hyogo framework 2005 and 15. Right? The Hyogo framework was the first plan which explained, described and detailed the work that is required from all different sectors and actors to reduce these disastrous loss. Now Sendai framework, the Sendai framework recognizes that the state has the primary role to reduce the disaster risk that we have discussed in the beginning of this class, but it says the responsibility should be shared with the other stakeholders, including the local governments, private and other stakeholders. In these lines only our disaster management plan have initiated, but you have to keep this main framework that stated by the SENDAI Framework for effective disaster reduction. Here it says it is the state that have the primary role for the disaster risk, but its role should be shared with the rest of the stakeholders, including the private sector. Right? This is what the SENDAI Framework says, because the effective disaster management can only happen in any country with a multi-stakeholder approach. Right? The Hugo Framework sets 5 priorities for action. The first two being the governance and risk reduction. We have discussed rest of these priority areas in our previous class. The SENDAI Framework sets 4 priorities for action to be implemented at national, local and global, and also at the regional levels. Right? We have clearly discussed about them. They are understanding the disaster risk. It need to be understood for an effective formulation of the plan for disaster risk reduction, strengthening the governance of disaster risk for managing disaster risks. Right? It need to be done. Investments in the disaster risk reduction and resilience. It is one of the important feature. We do have so many actions that need to be performed under the 3 phases of disaster management, like pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster. So such kind of resource mobilization is very much important. Improving disaster preparedness to ensure effective response, recovery and reconstruction and rehabilitation after the disaster, post-disaster, is also very much important. These are the 4 priority areas that are recognized under the SENDAI Framework, and we do have different kinds of priority areas under the Hugo Framework. They do, right, just overlap with each other, but there is a slight difference as such. Right. Next, we have this global platform for disaster risk reduction. It acts as a main global forum for emphasis on disaster risk reduction. It assesses the programs made in implementation of the SENDAI Framework for disaster risk reduction. Right. It meets biannually. Right? And India's delegation participated in it in Cancun in Mexico in the year 2017, when National Disaster Management Authority guidelines on museums was also launched during this summit. Right? This is about global framework or global platform for disaster risk reduction. And as I said, we do have this Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. It is a biennial conference jointly organized by different Asian countries, right, and United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The Asian Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction was held in New Delhi in the year 2016 with the aim of providing a platform to the member countries for sharing best practices in the field of disaster risk reduction. Right? Now, at this ministerial conference, the Prime Minister outlined the 10-point agenda to pursue the implementation of disaster risk reduction efforts in the region. We have clearly discussed in our previous classes what is this PM 10-point agenda for effective disaster risk reduction in the country. Right? 2 important documents were also released, that like New Delhi Declaration and Asian Regional Plan for the implementation of SENDAI Framework at this conference. Right? What are they? The New Delhi Declaration is simple, guys. It's just a political statement which spells out the commitment of participating governments towards prevention and reducing the disaster risk and strengthening the resilience of communities, as it is one of the important guidelines that we have discussed in the mitigation plans of each and every disaster, which is released by the guidelines of NDMA. Right? It commits to a people-centered and whole of a society approach towards disaster risk reduction. It also emphasizes the needs to enhance the capacity of communities to ensure participation of all stakeholder groups towards achieving resilience, as we already studied that sensitizing the communities is a very much important step in disaster risk reduction. Next, we have this Asian Regional Plan. It focuses on how to reduce disaster risk at national and local levels. It focused on developing the national and local strategies and policies and plans for disaster resilience and also tries to implement them. It suggested increasing investment in disaster preparedness. As we already discussed, mobilizing the resources for both the 3 phases like pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster is very much important, and also investing in disaster resilient infrastructure is also one of the important point as a part of our guidelines issued by NDMA, and the post-disaster reconstruction should be aligned with the developmental plans so that the developed infrastructure can cope up with the futuristic disasters. Right. So this is all about this SENDAI framework, right? So these are the three important frameworks which got originated from the United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Right? I hope you clearly understood all these Yokohama, Hyogo and SENDAI framework for disaster risk reduction. Right? Just try to listen to the class once or twice. These are mostly factual. Just try to remember them. You are going to incorporate all these points in your mains answers to add values. But try to remember, add a map as and when you answer a geography question or a question with respect to disaster management. Right? So this is all about these three: Yokohama, Hyogo and SENDAI framework. Right? In the next class also we are going to discuss with respect to rest of the topics of disaster management. Right? Thank you and stay tuned to Rathod's IAS.
Go to Google and type Rathod's IAS. Then you can see our website Rathod's IAS Academy. There you have to click on login or register in the blue color. So if you have not registered yet, you have to click on do not have account and fill the details. You have to give your name, email ID, your mobile number and password, and finally you can click on this register button. And once your details are filled, then registration will be successful, and click on OK. And come back and click again on login and register, and you have to log in now. So once you have login, click on the courses. There you can see course list, and in this course list you can see wide range of courses. Click on play course. If you have not purchased, you can see only 3 demo videos. After purchasing, you can see number of videos which are given here, and you can click on that video and you can click on play button, and video will start playing. And you can
Hi friends, my name is Sarvan Kumar. I am your economy faculty. Welcome to Rathod's IAS. Friends, in this class we are going to discuss about indirect taxes. In the previous class we have discussed about direct tax. Right? We have clearly discussed about the direct taxes. Now, where I said the direct tax is a kind of tax where the impact of
there you can see the notes which is uploaded in the PDF format.